Welcome back to Bold Ideas. I'm Gentner Drummond, and today we're tackling one of Oklahoma's most urgent challenges, early reading proficiency. This isn't just an education issue, it's a crisis that shapes the future of our entire state. Oklahoma's kids deserve better than 49th in the nation. If we don't get reading right by third grade, we're setting students up to struggle for the rest of their lives. Joining me is Jonathan Small, president of Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. He and his team have been pushing bold, practical reforms to turn this around. We'll look at what's working in other states and how Oklahoma can catch up and lead. We'll also touch on other big ideas facing our state, including recent Supreme Court decisions that matter to Oklahomans. Let's get started.
This podcast is authorized and paid for by Friends of Gentner Drummond 2026.
The content of this podcast episode is limited to the subject matter discussed. It is not an endorsement of or comment on any candidate for any elected office.
Welcome back to another episode of Bold Ideas with Gentner Drummond. Today we have a special guest, Jonathan Small, the president of the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, also known as OCPA, a conservative think tank in Oklahoma. OCPA's mission is to promote the flourishing of the people of Oklahoma by advancing principles and policies that support free enterprise, limited government, individual initiative, personal responsibility, and strong families. Jonathan, thank you for joining us today. And General Drummond, while today most of the discussion is going to be about reading proficiency, we will dive into some other issues, but let's first and foremost talk about why reading proficiency by the third grade is such an important part of your campaign platform.
Oklahomans deserve better. Our young people need to be able to flourish. And if we don't achieve reading proficiency by the third grade, all else is a lost cause. We have to. Empirically, we know pre-K, K, first, second, and third, these children have to be elevated. We have the skill, we have the capacity, we have the funding, we need results.
And Jonathan, OCPA has made a big priority as well. You've written extensively about this. What do you see working in other states that can be brought to Oklahoma, and how can Oklahoma go from 49th in education to a top state in the country?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Matt, for that question, and thank you, General, for making that such a high priority. You know, it's very interesting, at the risk of, unfortunately, talking about a neighbor that's doing much better than us. You know, about the same time, both Oklahoma and the state of Mississippi were facing the challenge of their pre-K through third graders just failing most of the country as it relates to reading. And so at that time, their legislature, as they had political turnover, they passed what were known as Reading Sufficiency Acts. And those acts basically say we're really going to try to espouse three important things. Teach the science of reading, which is phonics, really focus on teaching phonics through students, and then have an accountability mechanism where all the adults that are involved in the child's life and both of the government levels say, we're not going to promote kids past the third grade until they can read. And so the state of Mississippi, they passed a law very similar to Oklahoma's in about 2010, 2012, and they stayed the course. And so now the state of Mississippi has had the #1 gains in reading proficiency by just doing those very simple things of staying focused on teaching the science of reading, which is phonics, and then using assessments to let you know where kids are, and then holding all the adults accountable in the system by saying, hey, we're going to keep kids in third grade if they're not reading so that their lives are much better and teachers are much better afterwards.
So no more social promotion?
That's right. You know, but no more social promotion. Some people call it a gate. And, you know, that sounds like a really daunting task. But our neighbors, as far as our region are concerned, Mississippi, like you said, they don't have the talent that Oklahoma has. They don't have the access to the oil and gas wealth that we have. Yet they were able to, at less dollars per student, really turn around their very dismal reading performance. And unfortunately, Oklahoma blinked in the 2013-2014 time period, and we repealed our Reading Sufficiency Act. We went back to promoting students. And so it's not a surprise that our reading performance is actually now worse than it was more than a decade ago.
So it's not really an issue of money. We properly fund. It's an issue of allocation of resources and a priority of what we put our emphasis on.
No, you're right, General. That's exactly what it is that It's about whether or not we're going to really focus on those key things. You always hear people when they think about and talk about how important public education is to them. What's it teach them? Reading, writing, and arithmetic. But we see so often from all sides somewhat of a distraction going on and being too much being asked of our public school system. And what we see in successful models in public schools, charter schools, and private schools that are having success getting students performing at grade level in reading, at grade level in math, is they're intensely focused on that core three of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And so OCBA would be the first to say, and I know you've talked about it as well, General, that we know that too much has been asked of teachers. Too many things are being thrown at teachers. And if we would just go back to some of those basics, particularly with the funding and the talent we have, we could actually see a lot of success.
Now, we have seen a trend in our state where the value of the teacher is devalued. We have a superintendent of public education that does not lift them up, but attacks them. I'm on the opposite side of that coin. I'm a public school product. I deeply value a public school. I also recognize the value in the competition in the free market with private schools, school choice charter schools, and the like. But I would really love to see the narrative elevate the teacher. Statistically, I know that we have about 40,000 certified teachers who have left the classroom in the last 5 years. I'd love to incent them to come back in. And from the studies that we've conducted and the states that we've reviewed, to include Mississippi, Ohio, um, the school systems prioritize reading as the number one objective from pre-K all the way up until we've accomplished that, meeting the child where they are and teaching them to read.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, you've heard it, it's referred to as a cliche, but it really isn't. From pre-K to third grade, you learn to read. From fourth grade on, you read to learn. And both the student and the teacher are at the most disadvantage when you've got a kid going into the fourth grade and they're reading below a third grade level. It's a total disservice to the future of that child and going to be a huge frustration, understandably so, to the teacher, because they're now spending time having to decode words to students as opposed to focus on how you do fractions next or whatever it is.
And frankly, it's just not fair to the teacher or the classroom experience for the teacher to have to put so much emphasis on that fourth grader who can't read. I do believe, though, that we all read at a different level, and we have to come to the student where they are. And I'm excited to find a path forward, not to pretend to be a subject matter expert, but with data that OCPA's put together from studies that we've read throughout the United States, we can do better. We have to prioritize it. We have to demand that we perform.
Yep. No, I mean, I really think that solving the reading issue is actually what will be key to helping many of our public schools be able to perform better, because once students are able to read and navigate and understand, comprehend what they're reading themselves, it frees up much more time to focus on whatever subject matter that you're dealing with at that time.
So if I can, phonics is the way to go. Can you first just talk about how our school systems across the country, not just Oklahoma, got away from teaching phonics and the science of reading and defined 3Qing and some of the other techniques that have been used that have been proven less successful?
Yeah, that's a great question. People probably wondering, how did we get here? Obviously General's been committed. We're going to look at how we change that in the future. But what happened is, just over a period of time, some academics, and it really took off in the 90s. They came up with another way or method of teaching reading, which most of us would not be familiar with. If you're anybody that's 45 or older like I am, you probably had phonics. Well, there's something, like you said, Matt, called 3Qing, or another term that's used as whole language. And I know it probably sounds like I'm making this up, but I'm not. But it attempts to teach reading by teaching memorization of pictures or objects, or using cues, as opposed to what we all traditionally have learned, which is in pre-K, you start learning your letters. The reason why you're learning your letters in pre-K is because pretty soon they want to start pairing those letters together in phonics, so that you learn phonics and you learn syllables and you learn how to sound out words, so that no matter what words you see, whether you've seen a picture of it or not, or heard it on a show or something like that, you can read it. And that's the unfortunate thing about 3Qing or whole language. It robs so many of our kids of that fundamental decoding that they needed in order to be able to read successfully. And so that's why we've got to do what many states have done and that the best teaching colleges are doing is they're banning any other form of trying to approach the reading process other than phonics because it's proven and nothing else is.
I'm the grandfather of 7, and 5 of them are in pre-K through 4th grade right down. It's just been so exciting to watch their mothers and fathers be engaged in that reading process and see these children work through this process and just become hungry to read, hungry to acquire knowledge. And I think that's what we have to drive. We have to drive these points home.
One thing that General Drummond has talked about on the campaign trail a lot, and ever since I've actually met him years ago, just the importance of public school teachers in his life, going to Hominy Public Schools and the good education that he got there. We have seen teachers leave our state and the profession maybe not as attractive as it once was. You've written about rewarding teachers that are able to help deficient readers. Tell us more about your plans there and what maybe some ideas we could have for Oklahoma in that.
No, yeah, I really agree that one of the other challenges we have is that, if we want our best and brightest to work in teaching, they need to be financially rewarded for that. That's how the American system works. Other systems might try to get people to work for something that they're not being rewarded for how hard they've worked. That's not the system that we have or we're supposed to have. And so we really feel like that teachers who are willing to get in and tackle the reading issue should see both salary increases and then also stipends or bonuses, whatever term someone wants to use, if they're willing to dig in. The success that we're seeing in areas or populations or demographics where people typically say, hey, they have more reading challenges in alternative schools that serve low income students or students from single parent families, or some of the private schools that serve some of those populations. What has been successful is them investing in having teachers who are doing extra coaching with those students. And obviously, like we talked about before, really expanding teachers' ability to improve students' lives at that young age by limiting how much they're working on, really focusing on reading. So you're right. I feel like it's a combination of increasing compensation of teachers that are directly involved in reading and language in those early grades. And then I also think it's also a combination of lessening the load of other things they have to accomplish. That way they're able to be 100% focused on that.
I've had the occasion to be across our state, and I rarely pass up an opportunity to drop into a public school when I'm in a specific community or meet with teachers after hours. And I'm impressed with our administrative leaders across our school system, with our public school teachers, their devotion, commitment to this cause. I think that we as a state need to equip them. We need to give guidance and direction and rely on the expertise that we can bring to this table and move the needle.
No, and you're exactly right. It's not their fault. A lot of the teaching apparatus, like we said, this was not just tied to Oklahoma. This is not something that's a unique Oklahoma problem. The shift away from phonics and really it's spread through the teaching colleges. And then just as administrators and teachers are trying to tackle everything that happens in a school system throughout a given year, really I would call it the bad way of teaching reading kind of crept in. And so it's going to take some significant focus from all of us to say, hey, no, here's the new culture that we want to create around reading and the mindset around reading in Oklahoma, and that we all want to be helpful. No one, we're not going to worry about blaming anybody in the past. Let's look at what's successful and working in other states and apply that in the future in Oklahoma is what we think should happen.
That's an exciting opportunity for the state to have. I am so excited to jump into that, work with our teachers, our administrators, honor that profession, and bring the resources necessary for them to be successful. Our young children deserve better.
Well, let's move on from education and talk about a recent decision of the United States Supreme Court that upheld the Tennessee law, which is actually also upholding the Oklahoma law, banning gender reassignment surgeries for minors. Why was this so important for Oklahoma? It was an important priority for OCPA. General Drummond, maybe you talk about why it was so important for you, and you had a legal strategy that worked here. And talk through that, and why is this issue so important for our young people?
When we passed the law in the state of Oklahoma, we knew it would be controversial. We fully anticipated that it would be challenged. And I was criticized heavily for you deploying a legal strategy that permitted the state the time to prepare its defense to successfully rebut the attack by those who challenged our law. And I have the disability of being a lawyer. I'm a strategist. I thought this through. We needed to agree to the stay to continue while we mounted our defense. And when we were sufficiently ready and we defended it, it ended up being a successful strategy. And we now can protect our youth from having gender-altering surgeries that are forever. And we know empirically and anecdotally, young people change their minds. And so some people that think that they're convinced that they need to have a surgery as a minor are not really informed. We don't let people buy guns. We don't draft people in the military or ask them to serve. We don't give them the opportunity to drive. So many things. We let children mature before they make decisions. It made sense to protect Oklahoma's youth in this capacity.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, General. And we also agreed with the strategy. I think it's important for people to remember what was going on at the time. Right now we're all celebrating. There's been a lot of wins recently, with current President Trump, but that was not the environment when that law passed. First of all, it had taken a few years to make its way through the legislature. Also, at that time, the Biden administration had really, in its administration, had made an all-out assault on multiple areas of Oklahoma. So our Attorney General's office, I'm talking to you, you were there on the front lines. There were multiple cases and issues that we were involved in. And you mentioned disability of being a lawyer. I'm a CPA, which is close to being just as disabled, stands for can't pass again. But federal court, one of the sure things about federal court is it's very methodical, and we don't want to bore your listeners, but they tend to stay on the side of the status quo no matter what the issue is. And so if you would have forced the issue and not present our best case, you put the judge in the position of disagreeing with our side on a procedural ground when there's no reason to do that. And obviously the strategy worked, and now thousands of kids across the state of Oklahoma are protected. And so we really thank you for your leadership. And you guys were gracious enough to let us give our input from the day the law passed. And so we know that you were working on behalf of kids every step.
No, you've been a great partner. OCPA devotes inordinate amount of time and resources to research issues and share that data, and it's helpful. And you're a great partner, and that's why we reached out to you to get feedback and to seek input. That this strategy was sound on its face. You were defended my office and my decision, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, one of the things that came out, you tell in the writings, is that part of what your strategy led to is it allowed for both the legal case for why the legislature, as you talked about, has the ability to, why it's in the state's public interest to make sure that my teenagers, I've got teenagers, I love them, but I don't want them driving semi-trailer trucks. Well, in Oklahoma, you got to be at least 18 if you're going to get a CDL. It's no different than this when you've got something that's such a critical decision as what your gender is and what your future is going to be like. You want to take that methodically. And the strategy you put in place, it allowed us to tell both those sides of the story to the judge. The legal ramifications for why the judge should side with the state of Oklahoma, but then also all that other data and research. And it is why our opponents failed so miserably in front of that judge. And that strategy was the number one reason why that worked.
Well, you've talked about how it's been wildly different. We've got some wins under the Trump administration versus 4 years of Joe Biden. So a question for both of you, for you, General Drummond, how different has it been being the Attorney General under Donald Trump versus Joe Biden? And Jonathan, for OCPA, what are some of the policy proposals coming out of the White House that you'd like to see implemented here in Oklahoma?
So I came into office with the Biden administration in full force. And so my framework was adversarial. And I will tell you, every step Oklahoma would take forward, the federal government was there to say, we know better, you don't know anything, and swatted us back. We fought, filed 17 different lawsuits. And then when President Trump was inaugurated, it was like a sea change. All of a sudden, the Department of Justice reached out in every case we were in and said, could we please pause 60 or 90 days to reassess? They did it meaningfully, intelligently, thoroughly, and they came back and said, we side with the state of Oklahoma. Strategy's logical, it's sound, it's empirically based, and states are the closest to adjudicating their people, and they should have the right. And so it has been an absolute night and day experience to the positive of Oklahoma.
Most definitely. Yeah. We see one of the things that we think is coming just recently in the one big beautiful bill that was signed is, the concept of understanding how difficult an income tax is. And so that's going to eliminate the income tax on overtime and wages. Also saw other important provisions. And we say this in a way, I know all three of us, we all started our professional lives working a job that on paper doesn't look very important, but those jobs were fundamental in who we are today. And so we feel like the Medicaid work requirement was extremely important. Want to correct the fake news from the left. That requirement is just applying to able-bodied adults whose children are over 14 if they have them, and able-bodied adults from the ages of essentially 19 to 64. So it's not any of the most vulnerable population. It's literally the population that stands to gain the most from working. And so we feel like that's a huge, huge reform. And so, what we think about the big, bold ideas of where Oklahoma should be is some of the conversation you've already had is trying to make Oklahoma the place where work is rewarded the most. We've already talked about that already in the area of public education. We all pay our tax dollars, and we've got close to 700,000 people in public schools. So we want to make sure all those people can read. That's a fair thing. That's a really big, bold idea, I think. And then I think something that we've talked about for a while at OCPA. How do you fiscally responsibly stay the course of slowly eliminating the penalty, what we call the penalty on work, the income tax, but importantly, without raising any other taxes. So doesn't do us any good to, eliminate Oklahoma's income tax, but then have to adopt Texas's property tax system, or eliminate Oklahoma's income tax and have to significantly increase taxes on one industry. None of that makes sense. And so we think that there's an opportunity to have greater discussion there and efforts on how you fiscally responsibly over time lower the tax burden on Oklahoma.
I appreciate you raising that because we do in the media get beaten up. Oh my goodness, Oklahoma charges taxes. From a tax burden perspective, Oklahoma is among the lowest of all states. I do some business in Texas. I mean, the ad valorem taxes, the property taxes in Texas are triple what they are in Oklahoma. So they've shifted that, but they win the narrative. And we in Oklahoma can find a path forward. I think the work requirement of Medicaid, I know to our viewers that are in rural hospitals, there's bona fide concern, and I get that. I think that the narrative that you have suggested, that in fact the law proves out, is that this will not affect our most vulnerable. Those are that niche of our society that needs this help will continue to have it. Those who, and we know this from our self-experience, work rewards your better side. It gives us self-worth that can't be defined otherwise, as opposed to those that accept the handout from the government. That's not an honorable way to go throughout life if you have the alternative to work. And that is our motto in the state of Oklahoma. Labor will conquer.
Exactly. No, it's, one of the things, and it relates to why we've supported the Medicaid work requirement, why we have been so focused on reading. So there's a stat, it's called the success sequence, and it's pretty simple. In the United States of America, regardless of your demographic, who you are, on average, if you get a skill, and all that has historically meant is you finish high school, or even if you don't finish high school, go get your GED, or you get some sort of certificate, get a job, and then get married. No matter who you are, 97% of the people that have done that in the United States of America are not living in poverty today. Of the poor that have applied that principle, 75% of them have moved into the middle class. And so those values that you espouse, that you're talking about, they're Oklahoma basic values that we've got a lot of work to do in Oklahoma to continue to reward. That's why we support equipping students so they can read, because then they can get that skill, which will then empower them. That's why we support common sense work requirements, because it begins to help people build that can-do spirit and help them innovate. I'd imagine none of us are doing our first job. I think my very first job was mowing lawns. So I'm a city boy. You're from the country, so you got to do much harder labor than I did. But I still rely on that, I can do it, that work ethic. I still tap into that in my current job.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Jonathan. And Attorney General, thank you so much for this conversation. I hope it's informative for our viewers.
Jonathan, thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Glad to be on. Thank you.
Thanks again to Jonathan Small for joining us today and for the important work he's doing to champion third grade reading proficiency in Oklahoma. If you found today's conversation helpful, I hope you'll subscribe to Bold Ideas with Gentner Drummond on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. And don't forget to visit drummondok.com to learn more about Gentner's vision for Oklahoma, to watch past episodes, and get involved in his campaign. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
This podcast is authorized and paid for by Friends of Gentner Drummond 2026.